Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, and you may notice that I look pretty disheveled, almost a little sickly if anything. My beard is disgusting and way too long, and overall everything looks terrible, and you may think that this is because of the quarantine. Not so. The reason is because you guys asked so many fucking questions that oh my god. Like, I have been forced to essentially... Oh gosh, it's a little faded out, isn't it? You want, I guess, some kinds of yellows. But this book has basically been attached to me for the last month, trying to do all of the research and reading and triple checking sources and making sure things make sense, and trying to answer some really bizarre questions, some really specific questions, some really long questions, and we're finally at a point where we can start actually pumping these out. However, one big change from the Greenskin series to this one is that where the Greenskin series was all about nicely organized into all the questions had been separated to, you know, properly be in the place they need to be. We're not doing that this time because I ain't got the time for it. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to answer every question, but I'm going to put the questions that were asked in the description of the video. We'll do in the top comment. In the top comment, and there will be timestamps. And if you want to zoom to that question to watch it, great. But you're going to have to just deal with it because otherwise it's going to take another month just to read through everything and try and figure out how I want to break it down. So without further ado, we're just going to go in the order that I have them listed in this colossal 50+ page document with all of the questions and answers. So without further ado, let's get started. Our first question for today comes from Wah360. That's a good name. He asks us, do ogres have accents like greenskins do? And what is the canonical skin color for ogres? Because they seem to have two schemes from what I've seen. Alright, so for the first thing, greenskins and ogres do not have the same speech pattern most of the time. If you go back to the older lore, ogres back then tend to talk more like greenskins. Like, we're talking like 6th edition, so early 2000s. Then when the ogres were initially released, they tended to talk like greenskins, but that is no longer the case. In the modern lore, ogres are, at least the ones in the Mountains of Morn, do not use shorthand talk like greenskins do, where everything greenskins say is very, you know, that kind of like obnoxious British accent, and it's phonetically spelled, and there's a lot of apostrophes and missing letters. That's not how ogres talk. Ogres are, instead, they use full words, like they tend to articulate everything that they're trying to say, but the thing about them in their speech pattern is that ogres are very to the point. Like, they don't beat around the bush. There's no, you know, weaving in and out with their words or trying to be overly, you know, rambly like I am. They just say the minimal amount of words they need to get to the point of whatever it is they're trying to say. They're not wordy creatures. Probably the most, for example, there's a famous speech among ogres that Greasus Goldtooth gave when he defeated the Black Orc Horde at the Battle of the Firemouth, which was, the Battle of the Firemouth was like the biggest fight the ogres have had in centuries. And his speech is specifically cited as being a long-winded speech, and literally all he says is, today the orcs, tomorrow the world, let them all tremble. That's it. And that was considered long-winded. That's really the only notable thing about them. That being said, that is obviously subject to change, depending on where the ogres are, because if you're dealing with ogres, if they are not from the Mountains of Morn, they're going to pick up cultural habits for wherever else it is that they go. So if you're dealing with ogres that are hanging out in Araby, or near the Greenskins, or Chaos Ogres, or ogres in the Empire, or ogres in the Dwarven Realms, wherever, they tend to pick up the local culture in how they dress, how they talk, all that kind of stuff. So that'll change depending on the ogre in question. As for the skin color question, that depends on a lot of factors. Because ogres are so adaptive that when they are in a different place, they tend to... they're noticeably different. I would say that if you're dealing with ogres from the Mountains of Morn, which are of course the ogre kingdoms proper, then you're probably going to be dealing with what in our world you would expect to see if you were wandering around like the mountains of Mongolia and stuff like that, or those really, really upper elevation places, where you tend to get that skin color that tends to get added a little reddish due to like excessive wind burn and the cold and stuff like that. But once again, it depends on where you bump into them. Next question we have is from Fez Waller, who asks, what were the Ogre Kingdoms like before the Great Maw, and how long will we have to wait until after... stupid question. Second part's a stupid question. First part I'll answer. Second part's dumb. Shrek. So, I will say that... So, what were the Ogre Kingdoms like before the Great Maw? If you're talking about the Ogre Kingdoms physically, so the actual Mountains of Morn, like the geographical space, they were just a very wild, untamed land that were full of the harshest winters known on the planet, outside of, some of the extremes of the Chaos Wastes, and filled with terrifying megafauna, things that have gone extinct everywhere else on the planet. I assume, though, you're asking about the ogres themselves, like what the actual ogres were like before the Great Maw, and what we know about them is that, first of all, they come from way further east. The ogres actually originate from a large set of plains that were just to the northwest of Cathay, and here they were a relatively peaceful, nomadic people. They basically just followed the great herds around. There were a bunch of animals that wandered that region, and they would just follow them around to eat how they needed. However, eventually the ogre race started to, get larger and larger as far as their population. So some of them began to attack the people of Cathay because they're a lot bigger than humans, and they realized that they are very good at being bullies. And it's a lot easier to raid people for food and or eat the people themselves, as opposed to having to hunt for it, dealing with wild creatures. And it got so bad that some of the ogres were noted as having literally developed a preference for human flesh. So there were entire tribes that were basically exclusively going after the people of Cathay to eat and devour them. Eventually, of course, this really pissed off the Celestial Dragon Emperor of Cathay, and he got his massive council of astromancers to basically grab this big ol' meteor or comet made of pure warpstone and chuck it at the ogres. And when that happened, the ogres, 2/3 of their entire race were wiped out instantly. Like, they were just incinerated or crushed by the impact. And it turned their beautiful grassy plains, their homeland, into just a complete irradiated wasteland, filled with poisonous clouds of warpstone dust and wandering monsters that are made out of, like, green flames and fire and stuff like that. And then for the ogres themselves, we'll talk a little bit about that more later on, but the long story short is that the ogres didn't change a lot physically. Culturally they changed, and they were kind of cursed by the Great Maw, but we'll get into that more later. Alright, our next question is going to be from Adam Sagala. He asked, do the ogres have complex religious systems like the Empire, or is it purely from a priest, and each of them have their own interpretation of the Great Maw? And the second question is, what did the ogres worship before the Great Maw? So the first one, the ogres have a super simplified religion due to the very dramatic connection that they have with their two gods. Because there are actually two gods of the Ogre Kingdoms, not one. The two primary deities for the Ogre Kingdoms are the Great Maw, which has its prophets or priests, they're kind of both, or wizards even, in the form of the Slaughtermasters and the Butchers, while the Firebellies are the representatives of the Firemouth. And the Firemouth is the largest volcano in the Mountains of Morn, and possibly the largest, but at least the most active volcano on the planet. And the thing about both of these cults is they operate really, really strongly on a system of portents and prophetic dreams. So while there are a ton of tribes that have different priests, whether they're wandering Firebellies who have left the Firemouth Enclave, or they're the local Butchers or Slaughtermasters, they are all virtually always on the same page when it comes to what their god wants, or what the will of their god is, because, and like the practices that need to be observed, because all of them are basically tuned into that same set of prophecies and portents, and there's a very fundamental attachment they have to the Great Maw and the Firemouth that allows them to not have to deal with like different interpretations of their god. That doesn't happen. You know, they're kind of like greenskins in that greenskins, although greenskins like to disagree with each other and fight a lot, and Gork and Mork are primarily combative deities, there is no question among greenskins or the different shamans about interpreting the will of the gods. You know, they're all very tuned into the same system. Same thing for ogres. I will note that the Firebellies are a much smaller cult. You know, if you're dealing with ogres in a religious sense, 85% of the time you're going to be dealing with the Great Maw. 15% of the time you'll probably be dealing with the Firemouth. Especially because most of the Firebellies stay at the Firemouth, and usually tribes will come to them if there's a problem, but sometimes they'll wander out and go do other things, because they're welcomed with any tribe. And the last thing worth noting, especially because I brought up the Greenskins earlier, is that the Firemouth and the Great Maw are not seen as competing deities. So, like, if you have a Firebelly and Butchers in your tribe, there's no problems. There's no enmity between the two of them. They have different functions, and although they have different beliefs and systems that they have to observe, and different rites and rituals, they work in harmony with one another, because to ogres, all they care about is worshipping power, and they see both of those entities as being incredibly powerful things. So there's really no conflict there. And then the second part, which, what do they worship? So we do not have any records of what ogre religion or really, really specific things like that were like before the coming of the Great Maw. It's likely that A, the ogres did not record things like that, and B, all of the word of mouth aspects of things like religion were just completely obliterated when most of their species was wiped out. Granted, they bounced back well from it, but you know, everything, the Great Maw kind of just totally devoured that part of their history. I will say that if the ogres were religious back then, which they may not have been, but if they were, then their religion was most likely a very bizarre mix of, they probably had vague knowledge of the Old Ones, being one of the final species created by them. So they probably had like a very strange interpretation of what the Old Ones were, but it was likely very influenced by the religion observed by Cathay. So I would guess it was probably a very bizarre fusion of those two beliefs. Just like if you look at Nehekara, or the Tomb Kings, the Tomb Kings religion seems very much that it is the Old Ones, but interpreted through a desert lens and from the perspective of men. So it's basically the Old Ones, but morphed into something more relative to what they understand, and it became its its own thing in its own pantheon. So that's likely what existed before the Great Moss showed up, but any true evidence of that is totally gone now. Of course, the one exception being Chaos Ogres. For as long as Chaos has existed, there have been Chaos Ogres, almost at least immediately afterwards, and they of course worship one of the four major powers, or they're undivided. Bird Up asks, are ogres like onions? Well, I will say that ogres do have layers, and that they tend to have a quite absurd amount of muscle hidden beneath an absurd amount of fat. Much like myself, minus the muscle part. Raptor Lord, how often do ogres team up with halflings? Not terribly often, as the homelands of both races are very far apart and cut off because of like 2 mountain ranges, and then some. That being said, it is by no means uncommon to find ogre bodyguards hired by halflings in the moot, or traveling halflings, or the especially like the elder of the moot, who is represented on the elector counts. You know, he's not an elector count, but he is kind of up on that station. He's noted. The current one, I believe, is noted as having ogre bodyguards. Of course, there is the reverse situation when there is the reverse situation, which tends to be a lot more unfortunate, which is that halflings can often find themselves captured or sold to work for ogres as halfling chefs, often in kind of a slavery sense. That being said, they do tend to at least survive and are treated vaguely well, as having a halfling chef in ogre culture is a massive sign of wealth and influence and power. Like, that's a big deal to have a halfling chef working for you or your tribe. Though make sure you want to make sure that your butcher or slaughtermaster doesn't eat them, either out of jealousy or out of thinking that halflings taste good. Dom, hey Sotek, absolutely love your videos. On to your questions. Are there... Okay, this guy has a number of questions, so to make my life easy, I will go down them one at a time, answering them. So the first question is, are there any notable ogre settlements located outside the Mountains of Morn? Also, do Chaos Ogres ever establish their own tribes further north? So, to the first part, not really. Any ogres that you would find outside of the Mountains of Morn are already probably incredibly prone to wanderlust and are in the midst of wandering. So they're either going to be completely nomadic, so they're not going to settle down at all, or they're going to be individuals from other tribes who are just wandering around, and eventually they'll make their way back home to either the core of their tribe or to visit the other tribes for various trades and stuff. Because it has been known for an ogre tribe to almost entirely uproot and go wander west to, you know, smash their way through stuff, make a bunch of money, get a bunch of food and all sorts of stuff, but they always come home or die at some point. Ogres have not been known to settle down anywhere else, unless they're basically hired on by somebody, but even at that point, they're not really sitting down roots. It's kind of a temporary measure. As far as Chaos Ogres do not establish tribes, mostly because, A, there's not enough of them to really be like a sub-race, and more importantly, Chaos Ogres are not hated by regular ogres. Ogres are probably the only race that if someone of their species gets mutations, it's not really viewed as a big deal. If you get mutated by Chaos, ogres are very, very resistant to mutation. Just like halflings, ogres and halflings, when the old ones created them, were made very resistant to chaotic influence. So it takes a lot to mutate an ogre. So generally it has to be an actual Chaos Ogre to get any mutations. But if they were to end up visiting home, which they rarely do because they tend to get tied up in chaos invasions or big eternal battles and crap like that, they're welcome home. They are viewed as very strange individuals by regular ogres. Regular ogres do find their chaotic kin a little odd, especially because they worship human gods. But from a scholar perspective, it's believed that the reason ogres tend to view Chaos Ogres with a little bit of side eye is because of it's actually envy, due to the fact that whenever a Chaos Ogre mutates, it's usually like additional stomachs or additional mouths or, you know, extra limbs so that they can just shovel more food in their mouth or get better at fighting. And regular ogres do think that's very cool, but the way they achieve those mutations is kind of like, among ogre culture. But I would say the reason you don't see Chaos Ogre tribes is that to become a Chaos Ogre pretty much requires like fully signing up with a god, and at that point they're always on the move. And even if they weren't always on the move, they are welcome to go home and visit for anything you would expect from a tribal culture. You know, Chaos Ogres are not going to be the ones settling down to make families and extort tithes or any of that stuff. They are on the eternal, you know, they are on the conquest path for the rest of their lives. They're out there for eternal glory and power in the name of the dark gods, not, you know, super personal stuff like regular ogres tend to be at that point. Next question. Do Noblars feel the pull of a building wall? If so, does this ever present any issues for the ogres? No. Noblars are so vastly separated from the rest of greenskins to just like insane levels that they really do not identify with other greenskins anymore. They identify much more as a part of the ogre kingdoms than they do with any aspect of greenskin culture. Kind of like hobgoblins. Hobgoblins also do not feel the pull of a wall and want nothing to do with other greenskins other than killing them. But I should note, a big reason for that as well is that in the actual lore, it is very, very rare for any goblins to feel the true call of a wah. As in, they tend to be so insignificant and worry more about trying not to get crushed or killed by other orcs that goblins they don't have that innate inner fire that you would expect when a war boss calls a wah. Because traditionally, in the lore and in tabletop, the only thing that can call a wah is an orc. You have to have an orc war boss to call a wah. There is one exception to this, and that one exception is the only greenskin to ever live who was really able to pull off really getting the goblins going and getting them to wah and could call a wah himself was Grom the Paunch. And that was entirely due to the fact that he was such an immense size and stature that he basically inspired all goblin kind to something just next level. But, you know, in the lore, Skarsnik, for instance, cannot call wahs. You know, Skarsnik never declared a wah. Skarsnik never went out on a wah. He was building up towards it, but he never was able to get one off before the end times happened. And then, of course, he was defeated in the Battle for Eight Peaks by the Skaven. Number 3, do the Norths, Kurgan, or Hung ever target the Ogre Kingdoms on raiding campaigns? If so, which one would you consider their most common adversary? There have been countless battles between the Ogre Kingdoms and the northern tribes that make up the Warriors of Chaos. It is a glorious offering to the Dark Gods if a Chaos champion can cut down a tyrant or manage to take down an entire Ogre tribe somehow. Plus, if you have a sufficient enough show of strength, a Chaos Warband is very likely to attract a good-sized contingent of Chaos, or potential Chaos Ogres to join up with them and go further out and raid. That being said, it takes a really powerful warband of Warriors of Chaos to stand a chance against an Ogre tribe, just because Ogres are massive and scary and use black powder weapons. The Kurgan, the Hung, and the Norse, of the three, the only one that is close enough and honestly stupid enough to try and fight the Ogre Kingdoms by raiding especially would almost assuredly be the Kurgan. Because if you look from the top of the globe, generally, Norse, obviously we all know where the Norskans are because they have their own continent. But if you have Norska as your centerpiece, if you go towards the Dark Elves, that's generally going to be, like if you go north of Norska, you have where you're going to run into a lot of the Kurgan. And the Kurgan are the primary antagonist of Nagaroth, and they're the primary antagonist of the Darklands and the Ogre Kingdom area. And then the other side of the planet, so like Cathay and all that stuff over there, that's primarily where you're going to find the Hung. Obviously, it does get a little mixed up, and you can find any of them anywhere, but the Ogre Kingdoms, if they were going to be fighting a Norska-esque type army, so like Marauders, and not like fully decked out Warriors of Chaos, then they would most of the time be battling the Kurgan. But it would take a damn miracle of a Marauder chieftain to stand a chance against an Ogre tribe. Because Ogre tribes are just so powerful and deadly, and because they live up in the mountains, it's very hostile terrain. It is very difficult for any of those tribes to raid them. Plus, the way Ogre culture works, they do not have easy to acquire resources. Because you have to remember, the big thing about like the Kurgan, the Hung, and the Norse is that they specialize in raiding tactics. But for raiding tactics to work, you have to be attacking places that have a lot of resources with very little defense, cause a lot of damage, grab a ton of crap, pack it up in your boats, and get the hell out of Dodge. And that's what the Norskins and all those guys specialize in. Now, every once in a while, you know, some big Chaos champion will unite everybody or get a big steamroll going, and then they'll plow into Nagaroth or Kislev or Bretonia or whatever. But the Ogres are not a good target for raiding. They're not going to have the kind of stuff you're looking for. You know, if you're lucky, maybe you'll hit one of the wealthier tribes that has a lot of gold or something. But most of the time, the best thing they're going to have is a lot of food. But it's going to be ogre tier food, which has problems. Like, you have to have an ogre quality stomach to deal with it. So, hopefully that answers that. Next up, he asks, is the Firemouth also considered an aspect of Gork and or Mork, just like the Great Maw, or is it solely an ogre deity of their creation? Okay, so to clarify something, because this is probably going to be a thing of confusion going forward. The Great Maw and the Firemouth have no relation at all to Gork and Mork. Gork and Mork, Great Maw and Firemouth, totally separate things. In Age of Sigmar, which is the new fantasy setting by Games Workshop, the lore of the Great Maw has been rewritten or retconned so that the Age of Sigmar Great Maw is a sub-god created by Gorka Morka. Because in Age of Sigmar, basically each of the 4 allegiances have like an overall big god or like set of gods. And then there tend to be a lot of minor gods underneath them, depending on the allegiance. You know, for Chaos, you have the 4 Chaos gods plus the Horned Rat and Hashit's there somewhere. Then if you go over to Order, you have like a bunch of gods. If you go over to Death, you have just Nagash. But then there are the Underworld gods, but he's eaten most of them. And then if you go to Destruction, you have Gorka Morka's at the top. But Gorka Morka basically created a bunch of little gods. So he created the Bad Moon, which is what all the goblins worship. And he created the Great Maw, which is what the ogres tend to worship. And he created the Everwinter, which the other ogres worship. And he split back into Gork and Mork, which different people worship. So I know it may be a little confusing, but that's an Age of Sigmar thing. In fantasy, though, the Great Maw is literally a colossal warpstone meteor that impacted the Ogre homeland, and due to the insane amounts of mass death that it caused and suffering, it took on traits of all of the life that it was basically eradicating. So it kind of imprinted onto the ogres, and they imprinted onto it. So the Great Maw became a reflection of the ogre's inner nature, but warped by chaos. So it literally turned into a giant bottomless mouth. So you would walk up to this pit that's miles wide, and you would look down it, and it would just look like a big fleshy throat full of like teeth and all sorts of other nasty shit. And not only that, but the Warpstone core burrowed its way, it ate its way through the entire planet over the course of, I think, 2 years. And when it finished eating its way through the planet, it popped out on the other side by turning the other side into another mouth. So it's literally just two mouths connected through the entire planet. And the other mouth creates what we know as the maelstrom, or the Galleon's Graveyard, which if you play Total War Warhammer, you'll know on the Mortal Empires map or the Vortex map is Count Noctilus's home. So like that big vortex in the center of the ocean where everything that dies at sea is collected into that big vortex, that's the Great Maw, but from the other side. And it's a absurdly powerful entity, and it is vaguely sentient in an animalistic sense. It's very spooky. Meanwhile, the Firemouth is just a fucking massive volcano. Let's see. Hopefully that answers that. So the Ogres did not actively create the Great Maw, but it established a relationship with them, and it did curse them. The Ogres were literally cursed with a bottomless hunger. So there is no such thing as an ogre being full. They always feel the need to consume. They're kind of like gluttony and greed, just, you know, slapped together something fierce. Next is, other than the Great Maw and the Firemouth, do ogres worship, revere anything else? No. Nope. Do Chaos Ogres completely renounce their gods in favor of the Dark Gods? Do they worship both, or do they only worship the regular ogre gods? To be an actual Chaos Ogre entails fully embracing chaos and worship of the Dark Gods. So if you are a Chaos Ogre, you have no worship or relation to the Ogre Kingdoms or their gods. Like, you have to renounce all of that shit and fully embrace the dark powers. So they are pure chaos at that point. Do all ogres share the same oriental appearance, or does it depend on how far east an ogre/ogre community originate from? So all of the ogre kingdoms share that vaguely oriental appearance, you know, where they kind of have like the Fu Manchu mustaches and the top knot or the hairstyles that they do. That is just the ogre kingdoms, no matter where the tribe is in the Mountains of Morn. That being said, if you were to go further west and run into man-eaters, which man-eaters are the ogres that like really wander for like decades to explore the world and enjoy all of its different craziness, they are going to just take on whatever is like the thing in their culture. You know, so you're gonna, if you end up running into an ogre in the Empire, he's gonna wear Empire clothes, he's gonna change the way his facial hair and hair is styled so that he fits the local customs. They're always going to change all that stuff to suit their surroundings. But like on a pure physical level, they're always going to have, I don't know if Mongolian is the right word. I don't want to come off as like offensive or anything, but that's the only thing I think of when I think ogres. Just because I think of like the Huns, you know, so like that whole thing. They're always going to be based on that aesthetic. Okay, so our last question for today is going to be from Hungry Mimic. And he asks, if man-eaters are able to train in a variety of different places around the Warhammer world, could they be trained to the same ninja fighting style Clan Eshin seems to make use of? How would a Nipponese or basically any assassin man-eater ever work? So I am delighted to show you a picture right now, and you will see that there is canonically ninja ogres. So yes, they already technically exist. They are just as terrifying as you probably imagine to be, as they are troll-sized masters of stealth and assassination warfare who rely typically on carefully aimed poison-throwing stars and laughably huge katanas, or other bizarre weapons based on where they come from. But there apparently are stealth ogres. They do exist. Yes, I realize that makes no sense, but you know what? It's Warhammer, so try not to worry about it too much. And that's going to be it for today's episode of the Ogre Q&A. So congratulations. We completed 4 pages out of 50 plus. We're doing great. So thank you all for joining me. I will be back every morning at 7 a.m. for a new batch of roughly 30 minutes of Ogre Kingdoms questions. So until tomorrow, we'll probably have some other stuff coming out today as well, because I need to finish Mark of Chaos. But until next time, thank you for watching. See you guys later.